Abigail Mercer pressed her fingernails into her palm and did not cry. She had taught herself that much to stand still while the laughter moved around her like water around a stone. The plain ledger woman. That was what Caroline Bellamy called her, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. Abigail did not run. She did not answer. But her hand shook around the teacup, and no one saw it. If you've ever been underestimated by the very room you were holding together, this story is for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Bellamy estate in Midsummer, Virginia, was the kind of place that made a person feel either blessed or erased, and for Abigail Mercer, it had always been the latter. The candles were lit in every window. The fiddle had been playing since sundown. Families in their finest linens moved through the parlor and the wide front hall in clusters of laughter and perfumed air, the women fanning themselves against the July heat, the men gathering near the windows with their glasses and their opinions. The War of 1812 had ended, the country was breathing again, and Virginia Planter Society had decided that breathing again meant dancing, drinking, and negotiating the futures of their daughters with the urgency of men trading horses. Abigail stood near the east wall beside the long table of refreshments that no one was touching yet, with a cup of lukewarm tea she did not particularly want. She was 26 years old. She was not ugly, she was not foolish. She was not so poor as to draw pity, nor so wealthy as to draw interest. She wore a pale blue dress that had been let out once at the seams and pressed with care that morning, and her dark hair was pinned back in the simple, honest style she had worn since she was 19. She did not carry a fan. She did not flutter. She simply stood there watching a room full of people who had decided somewhere along the way that she was not worth the trouble of noticing. That was fine, mostly. Abigail had made her peace with rooms like this. She came because her younger sister Margaret had begged her, because appearances still mattered in a county where a family's reputation was the last currency they possessed, and because standing at walls had never actually killed anyone. She was watching Margaret across the room, laughing near the pianoforte, twirling once in the arm of a young man named Edward Coles, when she heard it. There she is, the plain ledger woman. The voice belonged to Caroline Bellamy. It always did. Caroline was everything Abigail was not, by the common measure of the room, beautiful in that sharp, deliberate way, dark-eyed, with a widow's elegance that had only deepened since her husband's death 2 years prior. She had money influence, and the particular cruelty of a woman who had learned early that her appearance was her currency, and had been spending it hard ever since. She was standing with 2 young women, the Hartley sisters, both unmarried, both very much in want of Caroline's approval, and they were looking directly at Abigail when she said it. The Hartley girls laughed. Not cruelly exactly, more the way young women laugh when they want to seem like they belong somewhere. "She manages the Mercer accounts," one of them said, hushed and amused. "My father says she's practically a clerk." "Practically," Caroline said. "She keeps books for half the indebted families in the county. She could tell you the exact worth of every man in this room down to the last unpaid tobacco debt." She tilted her head, studying Abigail the way a person studies a useful piece of furniture, which makes her very helpful to have around, and absolutely impossible to marry. More laughter. Quiet, well-bred, devastating. Abigail pressed her nails into her palm. She did not look away. She did not drop her eyes. She held the teacup steady and kept her face exactly as it was polite, composed, the careful blankness of a woman who had learned that any visible wound would only be widened. But her hand shook, just once. She set the cup down on the table before anyone could notice. She was going to leave. She had decided it. She would find Margaret, make a quiet excuse, and be in the carriage before the second set of dancing began. There was no rule that said she had to stay and be a lesson in humility for other women's entertainment. She turned and nearly walked directly into an elderly man named Josiah Pratt, who served as the Bellamy estate's head groundskeeper and who was at that particular moment struggling badly with an armload of empty candle stands that someone had stacked in the hallway without thought. "Oh, Lord," Josiah muttered, listing dangerously to the left. Abigail caught the nearest stand before it struck the floor, then the second. She set them both upright against the wall without a word, straightened the old man's coat collar where it had gone sideways in the scramble, and held his arm until he found his balance. "You all right, Mr. Pratt?" she asked quietly. "Yes, miss. Yes, thank you." He looked embarrassed and grateful in equal measure. "No one ought to have left these here. I told them." "It's all right," she said. "Is there somewhere they need to go?" he told her. She helped him carry them there, walking through a side corridor while the fiddle played on, and the laughter continued in the parlor behind her. She didn't think much of it. She never did. Nathaniel Whitaker had been standing near the doorway to the hall when it happened. He was 34 years old, a widower of 3 years, and the owner of Whitaker Hall, 1,200 acres of tobacco and riverland, 7 miles east of the Bellamy estate. He was the kind of man rooms paid attention to, not because he demanded it, but because he had the particular stillness of someone who had already made all the decisions that mattered and was no longer in any hurry. He had come tonight because Henry Bellamy Caroline's late husband's cousin had asked him to. Business reasons. There was a question of shared water rights on the lower property and social occasions. In 1816, Virginia were still the place where such things got quietly arranged before anyone picked up a pen. He had been watching the room with the detached patience of a man who would rather be home reading when Caroline Bellamy's voice carried across the parlor. The plain ledger woman. Nathaniel had heard it. He'd seen the Hartley girls laugh. He'd seen Abigail Mercer set down her teacup with the careful deliberateness of someone fighting something. Then he'd watched her catch the old man's candle stands, straighten his collar, and walk him down the corridor. Not with the performance of charity, not with a glance back to see who was watching, but with the simple matter-of-fact kindness of a person who noticed what needed doing and did it. He'd stood there for a moment after she disappeared around the corner. Then he'd turned to the man beside him, James Aldrich, who knew everyone in the county, and said, "Who is Miss Mercer?" James blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The woman in the blue dress, near the east wall earlier." "Oh." James glanced in the direction of the corridor. "Abigail Mercer. Her father was—" Robert Mercer had 300 acres over by the Shenandoah branch, but the debts caught up with him about 5 years ago. She's the eldest daughter. Manages what's left of the family accounts herself from what I understand. Keeps records for several other families in the county as well." He paused. "Nathaniel, she's not exactly I mean to say she's respectable certainly, but she's not—" "I wasn't asking whether to propose to her," Nathaniel said mildly. "I was asking who she was." James looked relieved and then slightly foolish. "Right. Yes, Abigail Mercer. Quiet woman, keeps to herself. You'd hardly know she was in a room most of the time." Nathaniel said nothing. He disagreed. The rest of the evening passed in the usual way. Introductions, pleasantries, a supper served too late, more dancing than the heat warranted. Abigail returned to the parlor after helping Mr. Pratt, having decided that running home would only confirm everything Caroline Bellamy wanted her to feel. She found a new place to stand nearer the back window and occupied herself with watching the room in that quiet cataloging way she'd developed over years of being overlooked. She noticed the ledger error in the household accounts by accident. Henry Bellamy's estate manager, a heavy-set man named Greer, was discussing numbers with another planter near the writing desk, the estate's charitable contribution to the county school fund, what had been collected from donations, versus what had actually been disbursed. Abigail wasn't trying to listen. But she was good at numbers the way some people are good at birdsong. She heard them without meaning to. The figures didn't match. The sum Greer was citing as disbursed was nearly $200 short of what the collection records she'd seen posted at the church last month had indicated. It might have been a transcription error. It might have been nothing. She thought about it for a long moment. Then she crossed the room, touched Greer's arm, and said quietly, "Forgive me, I couldn't help overhearing. I believe there may be a discrepancy in the school fund numbers. The church posting last month showed a different total disbursed. It may only be a recording error, but it might be worth checking before the figures go into the county report." Greer stared at her. The planter beside him stared at her. "I'm sure it's nothing of consequence," she said. I thought someone should mention it." She moved away before either of them could respond because she was not interested in being thanked or argued with, and because the look on Greer's face had told her the discrepancy was not in fact a recording error. She had made an enemy tonight. She could feel it. She was fairly used to that. Across the room near the window, Nathaniel Whitaker had been watching. He had seen it all. He had seen Abigail cross to the estate manager with that quiet, purposeful walk, had watched her speak low and calm, and seen Greer's face go flat, had watched her step away without waiting for acknowledgement. He set down his glass. Something was happening in him that he did not quite have a word for. It wasn't pity he had established that firmly when he'd heard Caroline's little pronouncement, because pity would have made him look away, and he had not looked away. It wasn't attraction in the simple decorative sense the room would have understood. It was more like recognition. The way you recognize something true when you heard it even in a room full of comfortable falsehoods. He was still thinking about it when the supper was called, and he was still thinking about it an hour later when the carriages were being brought around and people were saying their goodnights. He found himself near the front steps at the same time Abigail was waiting for her family's carriage, standing straight-backed and alone in the warm July dark, while her sister Margaret finished a last conversation inside. He stopped beside her. She glanced up, registered who he was, with the slight, careful expression of a woman deciding how much attention to give someone who didn't usually give any to her, and nodded politely. "Good evening, Mr. Whitaker." "Miss Mercer." He tipped his hat. "I wanted to say what you did this evening with Greer and the school fund numbers. That was well done." She studied him, not with flattered surprise, but with the measured look of someone trying to determine the motive behind a compliment. "You were watching," she said. "I was. Most people weren't." "I know." A pause. The night insects were loud in the hedges. Down the lane a carriage horse stamped and blew. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question seriously the way it deserved. "Because you caught the old man's candle stands before they hit the floor," he said. "And you didn't look back to see if anyone noticed." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "That's a strange thing to remark on," she said finally. "Maybe," he agreed. "But I reckon the things worth remarking on are usually the ones nobody else bothers with." She looked at him for one more beat, measuring careful, and then something else, something very briefly unguarded, before Margaret came tumbling out the front door with her wrap half on, and her cheeks flushed from dancing, and the moment folded closed like a letter. Abigail, the carriage, oh. Margaret spotted Nathaniel and went wide-eyed, with the particular excitement of a younger sister. "Good evening, Mr. Whitaker. I'm Margaret Mercer." "Miss Margaret." He bowed slightly. "A pleasure. Are you acquainted with my sister?" "I am now," he said. He glanced once more at Abigail. "Safe travels home, Miss Mercer." He stepped back, tipped his hat again, and walked back toward the house. The carriage ride home was quiet for the first several minutes. Then Margaret said, "Nathaniel Whitaker spoke to you." "He did," Abigail said. "He sought you out." "He was standing near the steps." "Abigail." Margaret turned toward her, fully, practically vibrating. "Nathaniel Whitaker has not spoken to an unmarried woman at a social event in 3 years. Everyone knows it. He barely speaks to married ones, and he sought you out and he made a remark. It was nothing." "What did he say?" Abigail looked out the dark window. The fields rolled past in shadow, the midsummer air still warm, even past 10 o'clock, the fireflies beginning to thin at the edges of the tree lines. "I reckon the things worth remarking on are usually the ones nobody else bothers with." "Nothing important," she said, but her hand resting in her lap had finally stopped shaking. And that she thought that quiet stillness where the trembling used to be was the strangest thing about the entire evening. Not Caroline's cruelty. Not Greer's face when she'd pointed out the missing $200. Not even the fact that Nathaniel Whitaker had apparently been watching her all night when no one else could be bothered. What stayed with her, what she turned over carefully in the dark of the carriage like a stone, that might be something other than a stone, was the look on his face when he'd said it. Not pity, not charity, something that looked unsettlingly like respect. She was not sure what to do with that. She had been in the business of making herself useful for so long that she had nearly forgotten there was a difference between being valued and being seen. She wasn't sure yet which one he'd meant, but the question kept her awake long past midnight in the small, honest room of the house her father had left half broken, and she had spent 5 years quietly mending. And she lay there in the summer heat, staring at the ceiling, listening to the crickets, and wondering why a man like Nathaniel Whitaker had been watching the one woman in the room that no one else thought worth watching at all. The rumors started before Abigail had finished her second cup of morning coffee. She was at the kitchen table working through the Hendersons' quarterly accounts, a family of tenant farmers 3 miles south, whose eldest son had broken his leg in June, and whose numbers were not adding up in any comfortable direction, when her mother appeared in the doorway with the particular expression she wore when she had something to say, and had already decided how to say it. "Lucy Hartwell's daughter came by this morning," her mother said. Abigail did not look up from the ledger. "What did she want?" "To tell us that Nathaniel Whitaker asked about you at the Bellamy supper." "He spoke to me near the steps," Abigail said. "It was a brief exchange, nothing of consequence." Her mother sat down across from her. "Abigail." "Mama, he asked James Aldrich who you were before he ever spoke to you." Lucy's daughter heard it directly. Her mother folded her hands on the table in the way that meant she was trying to be reasonable when she very much did not feel reasonable. "James Aldrich told half the county by breakfast." Abigail set down her pen. She had suspected something like this the moment Nathaniel had walked back toward the house and Margaret had started vibrating beside her in the carriage. She had hoped in the thin and practical way she hoped for most things that it would amount to nothing, a moment's curiosity from a man who noticed oddities forgotten by morning. It had not been forgotten by morning. "People will talk," she said. "People are already talking. Then they'll stop when he doesn't come calling and we'll all move on." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "What if he does come calling?" Abigail picked up her pen again. "Then I'll be polite and refer him to the church charity committee, because that is the only reasonable explanation for why a man like Nathaniel Whitaker would have any sustained interest in a woman like me." She said it without bitterness. It was simply the truth as she understood it, and she had always found that the truth, even the uncomfortable kind, was better company than hope. She went back to the Henderson accounts. Her mother went back to the kitchen. And 3 days later, Nathaniel Whitaker rode up the lane. He came on a Tuesday morning unannounced on a bay horse that was well kept without being showy, which told Abigail something about him before he even dismounted. He knocked at the front door himself, rather than sending a servant ahead, which told her something else. Her mother answered flushed and flustered, and called for Abigail with a voice pitched several notes higher than usual. Abigail came down the stairs already knowing who it was, and already composed, because she had made herself a promise in the 3 days since the supper she would not be foolish about this. Whatever it was, she would not be foolish. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "This is unexpected. I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Mercer." He held his hat in both hands, a gesture she noticed because men who were performing courtesy usually kept the hat on. "I have business in this part of the county today. I wondered if you might have a few minutes to speak. I have a matter I'd like your opinion on." Her mother made a soft sound from the hallway that Abigail chose not to acknowledge. "Of course," she said. "Come in." They sat in the front parlor, her mother pointedly nearby with her sewing. The rules of 1816. Virginia did not bend, even for wealthy widowers, and Nathaniel laid out with clean directness the actual reason for his visit. He was sitting on the board of the county school fund. There was a shortfall, a significant one, and he had reason to believe, based on what she'd said to Greer at the supper, that she knew something about where the discrepancy originated. Abigail looked at him steadily. "You came here about the school fund?" "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" He met her eyes without flinching. "I came because I wanted to know if what I saw the other night was characteristic of you or if it was exceptional." The room was very quiet for a moment. Her mother's sewing needle paused. "What did you see?" Abigail asked. A woman who noticed what other people missed, did what needed doing, and didn't wait for applause. He said it plainly without embellishment. I wanted to know if that was who you were, or just who you happened to be that evening. Abigail considered him for a long moment. Mr. Whitaker, she said carefully. I manage accounts for 7 families in this county. I have done so since I was 21. I helped my father negotiate with 3 separate creditors before he passed. I currently oversee the charitable contribution records for 2 church committees and the county school fund auxiliary. She paused. That is who I am. It is not exceptional. It is simply Tuesday. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. Then I have a proposal, he said. Her mother's needle went still again. A business one, he added with the ghost of something that might have been humor. I'd like to hire you formally as an account consultant for the school fund review. Something's wrong with those numbers, and I need someone who can find it without it becoming a public spectacle before we know what we're dealing with. Abigail blinked. Of all the things she had prepared herself for curiosity. Condescension, a misguided attempt at charity, she had not prepared for this. You want to hire me? She said. Yes. As a consultant? Yes. She looked at him for another moment. Then, the discrepancy I noticed was in the disbursement column. The posted church total and the figure Greer cited were $214 apart. That's not a transcription error, Mr. Whitaker. That's a pattern if you know where to look. Nathaniel set down his hat on the table beside him. Show me. She showed him. They spent 2 hours at the dining room table, her mother having eventually retreated to the garden in a state of dignified overwhelm with Abigail's own copied records spread between them and Nathaniel's careful, attentive silence on the other side. He did not interrupt. He did not explain things back to her. He asked 2 precise questions and waited for the complete answers. When she showed him where the funds had been quietly redirected, not stolen outright, but rerouted through a series of account transfers that would have looked like administrative adjustments to anyone who wasn't tracking all the columns simultaneously, he was quiet for a long moment. How long have you known? He asked. I suspected at the supper. I confirmed it this morning before you arrived. She looked at him steadily. I wasn't going to bring it forward without evidence. Accusations without proof only punish the person making them. You've had experience with that. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Yes, she said. I have. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he's filing something important. Then he said, I'll need these records, and I'll need you to be willing to present them if it comes to a formal inquiry. I'm willing, she said. It may not be comfortable. Mr. Whitaker, she said, and something in her voice was dry and quiet, and completely certain. Very little about my life has been comfortable for the past 5 years. I am not easily frightened by discomfort. He looked at her across the table, the records between them, the summer light coming through the parlor window, the sound of her mother's garden shears distantly audible, and said, No, I don't believe you are. He came back the following week. Then the week after that. Each time with a legitimate reason, the fund review a question about the Henderson family's tenant situation, a church repair committee on which he'd apparently just been appointed and for which he wanted her assessment of the construction bids. Each reason was real documented and exactly the kind of thing a man in his position might reasonably seek a competent opinion on. Abigail noticed that he always brought the actual documents. He never arrived empty-handed, never used the pretense of business as a thin veil. The business was always genuinely there. Which was, she thought, either the most efficient courtship in the history of Virginia, or simply the behavior of a man who respected her enough not to waste her time. She could not decide which, and that uncertainty was more unsettling than either option alone. The county noticed. Of course it did. A man like Nathaniel Whitaker did not call on a woman in a pale blue dress and a pinned-back hairstyle 4 times in 3 weeks without the county taking thorough note. Margaret was delirious with hope and barely contained it. Her mother had started pressing dresses. Abigail kept working. But she was aware of him now in the particular inconvenient way you become aware of something that had always been true but had only recently been named. She noticed the way he listened fully, without the half-distracted tolerance most men offered women who spoke about numbers. She noticed that he remembered what she'd said in previous conversations and built on it rather than starting over. She noticed that he never talked about her usefulness without also talking about her judgment, as though the two were the same thing, which no one had ever done before. She noticed all of this and told herself it meant nothing. She was almost managing to believe it when Caroline Bellamy arrived at the Tuesday market. Abigail was at the dry goods counter discussing a flour order for the Henderson family with the shopkeeper when she heard the familiar voice behind her. "Miss Mercer, what a surprise!" She turned. Caroline stood just inside the door with one of the Hartley sisters at her elbow, both of them in mourning dresses that made Abigail's sensible linen look like it had been borrowed from a tenant farmer. "Mrs. Bellamy," Abigail said pleasantly, "I hear Mr. Whitaker has been calling at your home." Caroline said it the way she said everything, as though she were simply reporting a mildly interesting piece of weather. "Several times, isn't it, on account of some committee matter?" "That's correct." "How convenient for you." Caroline smiled. "He does take his civic duties seriously. I've always admired that about him." Abigail turned back to the shopkeeper. "The full order, please, Mr. Dawes, and please add it to the Henderson account." "Of course, Miss Mercer. It must be gratifying," Caroline continued louder now, "to be useful to a man of his standing. You've always had a talent for making yourself helpful." The pause before helpful was precise and intentional. "Though I do wonder what he'll do for an accountant once the committee work is finished." The shopkeeper suddenly found the flour sacks extremely interesting. Abigail finished the transaction, folded her receipt, and turned around. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said very calmly, "I've been meaning to ask, have the school fund accounts been corrected yet? I know a formal review was opened last month. I imagine that's been a troublesome matter for your estate manager." The silence that followed was complete and very satisfying. Caroline's smile went flat. The Hartley girl beside her glanced between them like she wasn't sure which direction to step. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Caroline said, her voice a half-degree cooler. "Of course not," Abigail agreed pleasantly. "Good morning, Mrs. Bellamy." She walked out. Her heart was hammering against her ribs the entire time, but she did not let it show. And she did not stop walking until she reached the lane outside, where she stood in the summer heat for one long, controlled breath. That would not be the end of it. She knew that as surely as she knew the Henderson accounts were still 3 months behind. Caroline Bellamy did not let things go. She simply waited for a better moment to press harder. The better moment came sooner than Abigail expected. It was a Wednesday afternoon 11 days later when Nathaniel came calling and asked to speak to her privately, meaning on the front porch in full view of the road, which was about as private as Virginia Planter Society allowed. He sat across from her in the straight-backed chair and held his hat in his hands again, and there was something different in his posture. Not uncertainty exactly, but a kind of deliberateness, like a man who had made a decision and was now carrying it forward with both hands. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I'd like to speak plainly if you'll allow it." "I prefer plain speech," she said. "It's one of the few luxuries that doesn't cost anything. Something almost like a smile. I've come to propose marriage." The porch went absolutely silent except for the late summer insects and the distant sound of her mother dropping something in the kitchen. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because you are the most honest person I have encountered in 3 years of sitting on county committees with men who are paid to be honest. Because you understand land debt people and consequence better than anyone I know. Because you told Greer about a $200 discrepancy in a room full of people who would have let it pass, and then you walked away without waiting for credit." He paused. "And because I am 34 years old, and I am tired of quiet rooms." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "That is a very practical set of reasons." "It is," he agreed. "I won't dress it up and pretend otherwise. I believe in honest foundations." And what do you believe I would gain from this arrangement? Security for your family. A home where your work is recognized rather than tolerated. A husband who will not attempt to explain your own ledgers back to you. He held her gaze. And perhaps in time, more than practical reasons. I can't promise what I don't yet know. But I can promise what I do know, and I know you deserve better than standing at walls. The last sentence hit her somewhere unguarded, and she felt it move through her before she could stop it. She looked away. Down the lane at the road at the dusty, ordinary middle of a Wednesday in Virginia. She thought about 7 families' accounts. She thought about her mother pressing dresses. She thought about Margaret's hope and her father's debts and the small, honest house she had spent 5 years holding together with her own 2 hands and nothing else. She thought about what it meant to be valued, and whether that was the same as being seen. I need a week, she said. Take whatever you need. I will likely say yes, she added, because she was honest by nature, and he had just told her he valued that. But I need a week to be certain I'm saying it for the right reasons. Nathaniel Whitaker nodded once. He stood, settled his hat onto his head, and looked at her with an expression she could not completely read, not disappointment, not impatience. Something more like patience of the specific kind that comes from knowing the answer is worth waiting for. I'll be here in a week, he said. He walked down the porch steps. Abigail sat very still and watched him go, and did not let herself think about the way her chest felt, which was complicated and inconvenient, and nothing at all like ledgers. She had a week. She would be sensible about this. She was almost entirely certain she would be sensible about this. She said yes on a Thursday. Not because the week had made her more certain, it had made her less certain in the specific, honest way that more time always revealed more complications, but because she had sat with every argument against it and found that none of them were actually about Nathaniel Whitaker. They were about fear. And Abigail Mercer had spent 5 years refusing to let fear make her decisions. So she said yes. The wedding was small, quiet, and exactly what both of them wanted. A morning ceremony at the county church, her mother weeping into a handkerchief. Margaret gripping her arm so tightly it left a mark, and Nathaniel standing at the front of the church with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything. He did not look at her like a man receiving a prize. He looked at her like a man keeping a promise. She appreciated that more than flowers would have. Whitaker Hall was larger than she'd expected, and quieter than she'd feared. The house staff received her with the cautious politeness of people who had learned not to form attachments too quickly, and Abigail understood that instinct completely. She did not demand warmth. She simply showed up each morning, learned every name, asked the right questions, and let the work speak. Within 2 weeks, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Daly, a woman of 50, with the permanent expression of someone anticipating a problem, had started coming to Abigail first, instead of waiting for Nathaniel's direction. Within a month, 2 of the tenant farming families had knocked at the back door, asking if the new Mrs. Whitaker might have a moment. She always had a moment. Nathaniel noticed. She could feel him noticing in the quiet way he had, not intrusive, not performative. He would look up from his reading when she came in from a farm visit, and there was something in his face she hadn't entirely learned to interpret yet. Something that sat between respect and something warmer that she did not let herself name because naming it felt dangerous in a way she wasn't ready for. They were polite with each other, honest. Occasionally after supper, they talked for an hour or 2 about the estate, the county, the school fund review that was still slowly grinding through the formal inquiry process. He asked her opinions and meant the asking. She gave them and meant that too. It was a good arrangement. It was exactly what they had both agreed to. She told herself that was enough. She told herself that every night right up until the night she found the letters. Chapter track. It was a Tuesday in late August, 6 weeks into the marriage, and she had gone into Nathaniel's study to find the school fund correspondence he'd mentioned at dinner, a packet of letters from the county commissioner that he'd said were on the right side of the desk. She was not looking through his papers. She was looking for one specific packet in one specific location, and she found it immediately. The other letters were simply there, in an open wooden box on the corner of the desk that she had not noticed before. They were not hidden. There was no reason they should have been hidden. They were old. The paper had the faint brown at the edges that came from years, not months. She would not have read them if the top letter hadn't slipped when she lifted the commissioner's packet fanning open on the desk so that the first lines were directly in front of her. She read 3 lines before she understood what they were. Then she stood very still. They were letters Nathaniel had written to his brother James, who lived in Maryland. Written 2 years ago, before he'd ever met her. Before the Bellamy supper. Before any of it. The line that stopped her breath was this: "A second marriage. If I pursue one, must be built on practical ground. I have no interest in the performance of romantic feeling. What I require is a woman of sense, competence, and steady character, someone who will manage well and ask little." She set the commissioner's packet down. She read the rest of the letter, then the one beneath it, then the one beneath that. They were not cruel letters. That was almost worse. They were the letters of a reasonable, clear-eyed man who had thought carefully about what he needed and had written it down plainly. A wife as an arrangement, a marriage as a system, warmth as a secondary consideration if it developed at all. Someone who will manage well and ask little. Abigail stood in the study for a long time. Then she folded the commissioner's packet under her arm, walked out of the study, and closed the door quietly behind her. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in the immediate aftermath of a blow was a luxury. It came later, when you were alone, when the practical decisions had already been made. Right now, she had school fund correspondence to review. She reviewed it. She said nothing to Nathaniel, not because she was hiding from the conversation. She was not a woman who hid from conversations, but because she needed to understand what she actually felt before she brought it to him. And what she felt was complicated enough that she needed time to sort it. What she kept coming back to was this: he had not lied to her. At the porch that Wednesday, he had said exactly what those letters contained. "I believe in honest foundations. I won't dress it up." He had told her it was practical, and she had accepted that, and she had said yes. What she hadn't understood until now was that she had hoped somewhere under the practicality, under the sensible agreement, and the honest conversation that his reasons had grown into something beyond the original ledger entry. The letters told her they hadn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Someone who will manage well and ask little. She managed well. She could do that. She had been doing it her whole life. She just hadn't known until now how much it would cost to do it for someone she was in danger of caring about. The Richmond Charity Supper was the last Saturday of August. It was the kind of event that Abigail had always attended at the margins of a formal dinner for county landowners, judges, and political figures, organized annually to raise funds for the Poor Relief Committee. Now, as Nathaniel Whitaker's wife, she sat at the table rather than standing at the wall, and the difference in how people spoke to her was remarkable and slightly nauseating. She smiled. She was gracious. She answered questions about the estate and the school fund review with the careful precision of a woman who knew exactly what could and could not be said in a public room. Nathaniel sat beside her and occasionally touched her hand, which she understood was a social signal and not a personal one, and she allowed it and smiled at the right moments and did not think about the letters. She was doing very well until Caroline Bellamy stood up. Caroline had not lost her position at the table. Whatever embarrassment the school fund inquiry had caused Greer, it had not yet touched Caroline directly, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a woman who believed herself untouchable. She stood to make a remark about the poor relief donations, which was perfectly appropriate, and then she tilted her head toward Abigail, and Abigail felt it coming the way you feel a change in weather. "I do think it's wonderful," Caroline said, addressing the table generally with the warm tone of a woman sharing something pleasant, "that the charitable work in this county has gained such a devoted new champion. Mrs. Whitaker has been very active since her marriage, very visible." She smiled. "One does wonder, of course, how much of that visibility is generosity and how much is simply strategy." The table went quiet. The particular quality of the silence was the kind that came when someone had said something that everyone was thinking, but no one had intended to say aloud in company. Caroline continued, her voice gentle and curious, as though she were merely posing an interesting question for general consideration. When a woman of limited means marries a man of considerable ones, and then immediately begins inserting herself into every charitable institution in the county, well, one can admire the efficiency at least. Someone at the far end of the table laughed nervously. A judge's wife studied her soup. Abigail felt Nathaniel shift beside her. She put her hand on his arm. "Not now," the touch said. "Let me." She looked at Caroline across the table and did not raise her voice. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said, "I'd like to ask you something. The children who received meals through the Poor Relief Committee last winter, do you know their names?" Caroline blinked. "I beg your pardon. Their names. The children who were fed." Abigail kept her voice even. "I ask because I know them. All 14 of them. I know which ones were sick in February, and which families couldn't afford the physician, and which mothers came to the church auxiliary in tears because the disbursement had been delayed by an administrative error in the fund accounts." She paused. "Charity done for visibility tends not to require that level of detail, Mrs. Bellamy. Visibility doesn't ask you to know their names." The table was completely still. Caroline's expression had gone flat and controlled the beautiful face, suddenly a mask rather than a face. "How touching," she said. Her voice was soft. It was the softness of something sharpening. "And yet here you sit, at the table, in the silk dress, benefiting from the very fortune you so humbly administer on behalf of the county." She looked at Abigail with the particular coldness of a woman who had nothing left to lose in this exchange and knew it. "You are useful, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll grant you that. Whether you are beloved, well, I imagine that's a question your husband is better placed to answer than I am." The word landed like a stone in still water. Beloved. Abigail held Caroline's gaze and did not look away, and did not let what was happening in her chest show anywhere on her face. Then she said, "Mrs. Bellamy, I think it would be appropriate for you to know that the formal inquiry into the school fund accounts has identified 4 separate instances of redirected disbursements totaling $860 over 2 years. The inquiry commissioner will be presenting findings to the county court on September the 15th. She let that settle for exactly 1 second. "I mention it only because I believe in transparent communication, and because you mentioned efficiency, and I did want to demonstrate it." The silence that followed was the longest one of the evening. A judge near the center of the table cleared his throat. Someone's water glass touched the table with a small, definitive click. Caroline did not respond. For perhaps the first time in Abigail's memory, Caroline Bellamy had nothing to say. Nathaniel's hand found Abigail's under the table. His grip was firm and certain, and said something she could not read and was too shaken to examine. She withdrew her hand gently. She picked up her water glass. She took a steady drink. She had won the moment. She knew that. The table knew that. Caroline knew that. And yet she sat there feeling nothing like victorious, because the word Caroline had chosen was still in the room, still in her chest, pressing against a truth she had been trying not to look at directly. Beloved, not useful, not practical, not a woman of sense and steady character who managed well. Beloved. She had spent 30 minutes driving Caroline Bellamy into a corner in front of judges and landowners, and the word that had broken her was not any of the cruel ones. It was the one that described what she was not. They rode home from Richmond in a silence that was different from their usual silence. Their usual silence was comfortable two people who didn't need to fill space for the sake of it. This silence had shape and weight, and neither of them touched it. Nathaniel spoke first. "You were extraordinary tonight." "I was effective," Abigail said. "That's not the same thing." A pause. The carriage moved. The road was dark and the summer night was warm. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. It was the most dishonest thing she had said to him since the porch. He knew it. She could tell he knew it by the way he didn't answer immediately, the way he sat with it for a moment before saying quietly, "Abigail." "I'm tired, Nathaniel," she said. "It was a long evening. I'd like to rest." He did not push. He was not a man who pushed. That was something she had respected about him from the beginning. Tonight it felt like its own kind of loneliness. She looked out the carriage window at the dark passing fields and thought about 14 children and their names and their mothers' faces, and about a letter written 2 years ago to a brother in Maryland, and about the difference between being valued and being loved, which she had understood intellectually her entire life and was only now beginning to understand in the place where it actually lived. She had told herself that Thursday, when she said yes, that respect was enough. She had believed it. What she had not accounted for was this. What happens when you stop believing it and you're already standing inside the life you chose? The carriage wheels turned. Whitaker Hall came into view at the end of the lane. Abigail kept her face still and her hands folded in her lap, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of it until she was alone in her room, with the door closed and the candle out and the summer dark pressing against the window. Then she let herself feel it, and it was considerable. She was different after Richmond, and they both knew it, not cold. Abigail was too honest for performance, and coldness was a performance she had never had the patience for. She was polite. She was capable. She continued managing the household accounts meeting with tenant families, corresponding with the school fund commissioner, and sitting across from Nathaniel at the supper table every evening with the careful composure of a woman who had decided somewhere in the dark of that carriage ride home that she would not burden him with feelings he had never asked her to have. She had agreed to a practical arrangement. She would honor it practically. But the distance was there, and it had shape, and Nathaniel felt it the way you feel a change in temperature, not dramatic, not announced, just suddenly present in a room that had been warmer before. He watched her. She knew he watched her. Neither of them mentioned it. It lasted 9 days before Mrs. Daly broke it open without meaning to. It was a Wednesday morning, and Abigail was in the back kitchen reviewing the month's household expenditures when Mrs. Daly came in with the linen inventory and sat down across from her with the look of a woman who had decided to say something and had already decided she was going to say it regardless of the reception. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "I've worked in this house for 11 years. Abigail looked up from the ledger. "I know Mrs. Daly." Mr. Whitaker's first wife, God rest her, was a kind woman. Gentle. She never raised her voice, and she never complained, and she managed this house the way a person manages something they've been given responsibility for, but don't entirely believe belongs to them. Mrs. Daly set the linen inventory on the table. "If you'll forgive me saying so, ma'am, you are not that." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Is that a compliment?" "It is." Mrs. Daly's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. "You walk into a room and you see what's wrong with it. Not to criticize, to fix it. You knew Thomas Greer's boy had been underpaid for 3 months before Thomas said a word because you checked the wage records yourself. You sent medicine to the Cooley farm when Ida Cooley was sick and told no one you'd done it. You know every name in this house and every name on this land." She paused. "That's not management, Mrs. Whitaker. That's care. And this house hasn't had that in a long while." Abigail looked at the ledger for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this? Because something's changed in you this past week and a half, and the house feels it, and I reckon Mr. Whitaker feels it most of all, and I am too old to watch two sensible people make themselves miserable out of pride." The kitchen was very quiet. "It isn't pride," Abigail said carefully. "Then what is it?" She almost said nothing. The word was right there, the safe word, the manageable word. Instead she said, "I found some letters. Old ones, in the study." She kept her voice level. "He wrote to his brother before we met, about what he wanted in a second marriage." Mrs. Daly waited. "He wanted someone practical," Abigail said. "Someone who would manage well and ask little." She looked up. "I am those things. I have always been those things. I just didn't know when I agreed to be them here that it would feel like being hired twice." Mrs. Daly was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Whitaker, can I tell you something about those letters?" Abigail looked at her. "He wrote them after Eleanor died, his first wife. She was sick for 2 years before the end, and he sat with her every night of those 2 years, and when she was gone, He was a man who had loved someone very much and lost her, and come out the other side, not sure he had any of that left in him. Mrs. Daly's voice was even and plain, the way voices are when they're telling the truth, without embellishment. Those letters were written by a man who had decided he was done with that kind of feeling. Not because he didn't want it, because he didn't think he could survive losing it again. Abigail was very still. "That was 2 years ago," Mrs. Daly said, "before he sat across your dining room table for 2 hours and forgot to leave. Before he came home from every committee meeting talking about what you'd said and what you'd noticed and what you'd done. Before Richmond." She picked up her linen inventory and stood. "I'm not saying what he feels, ma'am. That's his to say. I'm only saying that the man who wrote those letters and the man who lives in this house right now are not entirely the same man." She walked out. Abigail sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she left. Nathaniel found her that evening on the back porch. She was sitting with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, watching the late summer fields go dark at the edges, and she heard his footsteps on the boards and did not turn around. He sat down in the chair beside her. He did not speak immediately, which was characteristic of him. He let silences exist without filling them. But this silence had a different quality than usual. It was the silence of a man who had made a decision and was choosing his entrance point carefully. "Mrs. Daly told me she spoke to you," he said. "She mentioned the linen inventory," Abigail said. Abigail. She turned and looked at him, because she had promised herself from the beginning that she would not be a coward about direct things, and his use of her given name without preamble was a direct thing. "You found the letters," he said. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes." "When?" "3 weeks ago. I wasn't looking for them. The commissioner's packet slipped and they fanned open." She kept her voice even. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't because I needed to decide what I actually felt before I said anything, and what I felt kept changing every time I thought about it." "What do you feel now?" "I feel," she said slowly, "that you were honest with me on the porch that Wednesday. You told me exactly what you were offering, and I accepted it with my eyes open. I don't have grounds to be wounded by a confirmation of what you already told me." She paused. "But I am wounded, and I thought I ought to say that plainly since we agreed on plain speech." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Please." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the same dark fields she'd been watching, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man who was being careful with something, because it mattered. "When I wrote those letters to James, I meant every word. I was 32 years old, and I had just spent 2 years watching someone I loved more than I had words for disappear by degrees, and when it was over, I told myself that love, like that, the kind that cracks you open, was something I was done with." He stopped. "I meant it sincerely. I was not lying to myself or to James. I believed it completely." "And now?" Abigail asked. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her the way he'd been doing since the Bellamy supper, the way she'd been trying not to let herself register. "Now I have watched you save the Henderson farm from foreclosure by negotiating a payment arrangement the bank hadn't offered because no one had ever asked the right question. I have watched you learn the name of every child on this land within the first 2 weeks. I have watched you stand in front of a room full of judges and landowners and face down Caroline Bellamy without flinching, and then sit beside me in a carriage and tell me you were perfectly fine when you were the furthest thing from it." His voice was steady and certain, and very quiet. "And I am telling you now that the man who wrote those letters did not know you existed, and the man sitting on this porch does, and they are not the same man." Abigail's chest did something complicated. She looked away. "Pretty words," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, "are not the same as changed ones." "No," he agreed. "They're not." He stood up. "Give me a week." She looked up at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You asked me for a week before you said yes. I'm asking for a week now." His expression was serious and certain. "Not to convince you with speeches. To show you something worth seeing." She studied him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He nodded once, went inside. Abigail sat alone on the porch with her cold tea and the darkening fields, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not entirely trust yet, but could not bring herself to dismiss. The week was not what she expected. She had expected gestures, flowers perhaps, or formal dinners, or some Virginia planter's version of romantic demonstration. She had expected something she would have to evaluate for sincerity. What she got instead was this. On Monday, Nathaniel rode to the county court office and filed a formal record of attribution for the school fund account work, listing Abigail Mercer Whitaker as the originating investigator of the fund discrepancy case. He did not tell her he had done it. She found out from the commissioner, who wrote to congratulate her. On Wednesday, he called Thomas Greer, not the estate Greer, a different man, a farmer, into the study, and told him with Abigail present that the back wages owed to Thomas's son were being paid in full, with an additional sum for the months the underpayment had gone uncorrected. He then turned to Abigail and said in front of Thomas, "My wife identified this. The correction is hers." Thomas Greer took off his hat and looked at Abigail and said, "God bless you, Mrs. Whitaker," with the simple feeling of a man who meant it entirely. Something happened in her throat that she managed barely to keep contained. On Friday, Nathaniel came home from a meeting of the county charity board and set a document on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was a formal transfer of administrative authority over 3 of Whitaker Hall's charitable endowments: the school fund, the poor relief contribution, and the church repair fund, into her name. Not as a proxy, not as a representative, as the named administrator. She looked at the document for a long time. "This is a legal transfer," she said. "Yes, you can't simply take it back if we disagree on something." "I know." "Nathaniel." She looked up. "This is not a gesture. This is a permanent legal instrument." "Yes," he said. "It is. Because it was already yours. The work was yours. The relationships were yours. The results were yours." He met her eyes without wavering. "I was simply the name on the account. This corrects that." She looked back at the document. She felt something shift inside her again. Something larger this time. Something she had been holding very carefully in place, like a stone wedged against a door, and the stone was moving. "This is not the same as what I need from you," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I know it isn't. And I'm not offering it as a substitute." He sat down across from her. "Abigail, I need to ask you something." "Ask." When Caroline said that word at Richmond, beloved, what happened? She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I realized I'd been hoping for something I hadn't admitted I was hoping for, which made me feel foolish because I had agreed to something else, and I knew what I'd agreed to, and hope that contradicts an agreement you made with open eyes is just self-deception dressed as feeling." "You're not self-deceived," he said. "You are one of the least self-deceived people I have ever met." "Then I am simply foolish." "You are not that either." He leaned forward. His voice dropped, but it didn't soften. It was the quieter tone he used when something mattered more, not less. "You hoped for something real, because something real was developing. That is not foolishness. That is accuracy. You noticed it before I had the courage to name it." Abigail looked at him. Her heart was doing something inconvenient, and she was aware of it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because she had promised herself plain speech, and this was the moment for it. "Then name it," she said. He held her gaze. "I love you," he said. "Not what you do, not how well you manage, not the competence or the courage or the work, though I honor all of it. You." He stopped. The woman who pressed her nails into her palm at the Bellamy supper and did not run. The woman who helped the old man with the candle stands and didn't look back to see if anyone noticed. The woman who told me she was perfectly fine in that carriage when she was holding herself together with both hands and wouldn't let anyone see the seam. His voice was steady and certain. "I love her. I should have said it before Richmond. I should have said it the week after we married. I didn't because I was afraid of it. After Eleanor, I was afraid of how much it meant. The kitchen was completely still. Abigail set down the legal document. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment, at the calluses from years of pen and ledger work, at the plain honest evidence of everything she had spent herself on for half a decade. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time in their marriage, she let him see all of it. Not the composed face, not the managed expression, but the actual woman, tired and careful and hoping and afraid, and said, "I needed you to say that." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry it took me this long." She nodded once. She was not going to cry at the kitchen table over the household accounts and a legal transfer document. She was going to be sensible about this. She was completely failing to be sensible about this. "I need a moment," she said, her voice gone slightly uneven. "Take whatever you need," he said. Which was, she thought, exactly what he had said on the porch months ago, when she'd asked for a week, and the fact that it was still true, still the honest answer, still the patient one, made the stone against the door move all the way aside. She pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed. Nathaniel sat quietly across from her and did not fill the silence because he understood that sometimes silence was not emptiness, but necessary weight, and he gave it to her without condition. Outside, the late summer evening was cooling at last. Somewhere on the back property, one of the tenant children was calling another's name across the field, in the uncomplicated voice of someone who still believed the world would answer. Abigail listened to it, and slowly, carefully, like a woman who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and was only now learning how to set it down, she let herself believe him. The morning after Nathaniel said it plainly without dressing it up the way she had always needed. Truth delivered, Abigail woke before dawn and lay still in the dark for a long moment, testing the feeling the way you test ice before you step onto it. It held. That was the thing about Nathaniel Whitaker. Everything he offered held. The practical proposal had held. The honest foundation had held. The week he'd asked for had held. And the legal document was still on the kitchen table with his signature on it. And the words he'd said were still in the room where he'd said them, unchanged and uncomplicated by morning. She got up. She dressed. She went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while the light came in. And when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later and looked at her with the careful expression of a man who was not entirely sure what he would find, she turned and said, "Good morning," in a voice that was different from the voice she'd been using for 9 days. He heard the difference immediately. She could see it in the way his shoulders settled. "Good morning," he said. He poured his coffee. She moved the legal document to the desk. They sat at the table and talked about the Henderson farm and the school fund commissioner's September hearing and whether the back porch boards needed replacing before the weather changed, and it was completely ordinary and entirely different from anything that had come before, because underneath the ordinary was something that had been named now, something that did not need to be performed or managed or held at careful distance. It was, Abigail thought, what honest felt like when it finally included everything. The county school dedication was set for the third Saturday of September. It had been in planning for months, a formal ceremony for the new academy building, that the school fund, once its accounts were properly corrected and fully restored, had been able to finance. The building itself was modest, solid, built for use rather than impression, and it sat on a quarter-acre lot, donated by 3 separate landowners who had agreed after the inquiry findings became public that visible contribution was preferable to visible association with what Greer had done. The ceremony was to be attended by judges, landowners, ministers, and most of the county's prominent families. Nathaniel, as the school fund board's acting chairman through the inquiry period, was expected to give the primary address. He told Abigail this at breakfast 3 days before the ceremony. She said, "All right, do you want me to review the speech?" He said, "There's been a change to the program. I'd like to discuss it with you." She looked up from her coffee. He explained plainly, and without preamble, that he had asked the commissioner to adjust the ceremony program. He would not be giving the primary address. He had written to 3 people, the commissioner, the county judge, and the minister, and requested that Abigail be introduced as the founder of the school fund investigation and invited to speak in her own right. Abigail set down her cup. "You didn't ask me first," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't, because I knew you'd say it wasn't necessary." "It isn't necessary." "It is," he said. "It is necessary, Abigail. The work was yours. The record should say so in front of the people who spent 3 years watching you stand at the edge of their rooms and deciding you weren't worth the trouble." She was quiet for a moment. "Caroline Bellamy will be there," she said. "Yes." "Half the county will be there." "Yes." "I have never given a public address in my life." "I know," he said. "You'll be fine." She looked at him across the breakfast table. He looked back with the calm certainty of a man who had made up his mind and was not going to be argued out of it by false modesty dressed as practical concern. "You are considerably more stubborn than you appear," she said. "So are you," he said. "That's what I'm counting on." The morning of the dedication, Abigail dressed without her mother's help, which was a statement of intention more than preference. She chose the dark green dress, not the pale blue she'd worn to the Bellamy supper, not the cream she'd worn at the wedding, but the dark green that she'd bought with her own money from the first consulting fee she'd ever charged, which she had never worn because she'd always told herself it was too much. It was not too much. It was exactly right. Margaret came to help with her hair and spent the entire time alternately arranging pins and crying, which Abigail bore with patience and a great deal of affection. "You're going to stand up there in front of all of them," Margaret said, her voice bright with emotion. "In front of every person who ever called you the plain ledger woman." "I'm going to talk about a school fund," Abigail said. "Abigail." "Margaret, will you please just for 5 minutes let yourself understand what this is?" Abigail looked at her sister in the mirror. At the woman who had gripped her arm until it bruised at the church wedding. At the girl who had twirled at the Bellamy supper while Abigail stood at the wall. "I understand what it is," she said quietly. "I'm just not going to cry about it before I get there." Margaret pressed a kiss to the top of her head and said nothing else, which was the most considerate thing she had done in recent memory. The ceremony ground was full when they arrived. Not overflowing in the way of fashionable events, but full in the real sense people who had come because they had a reason to be there. Tenant families with children in their best clothes, ministers and their wives, farmers who had never attended a county ceremony in their lives, but had shown up today because word had traveled the way word always travels in a county where everyone knows everyone else's troubles, that something worth witnessing was going to happen. Abigail stepped down from the carriage and felt the weight of it, all those faces, all that attention, and did not let herself calculate it. She simply walked forward, Nathaniel beside her, his hand briefly at her back in the way he'd started doing, natural and certain as though it had always belonged there. She saw Caroline Bellamy near the far edge of the gathering, standing slightly apart from the cluster of prominent families she'd once commanded. The school fund inquiry findings had been filed with the county court 2 weeks prior. Greer had been dismissed. 2 board members had quietly resigned. Caroline's name was not in the official record, but everyone who knew how to read a room understood the shape of what had happened. Caroline saw Abigail looking at her. She held the gaze for exactly 1 moment, then looked away. That was all. No performance, no last thrust of cruelty. It was, Abigail thought, the quietest possible ending to something that had been very loud for a very long time. The commissioner opened the ceremony with formal remarks. The minister offered a prayer. 2 landowners spoke briefly about the importance of education for the county's future, using the careful language of men who wanted to be associated with the successful outcome, without drawing attention to how the problem had originated. Then the commissioner called Nathaniel forward. Nathaniel walked to the front of the gathering, and the crowd settled into the attentive silence that his presence always produced. He stood for a moment, looked out at the assembled faces, and then said, "I was asked to give the primary address today as chairman of the school fund board. I'm going to decline that honor and explain why. A murmur moved through the crowd. Abigail, standing near the front, felt it pass over her. "This building," Nathaniel said, "exists because someone looked at a set of account numbers on the wrong side of a ballroom and refused to let it go. Not for recognition. Not for advantage. Because hungry children do not stop being hungry because the people responsible for feeding them find it inconvenient to be accurate." He paused. "The person who did that work is my wife, and I will not stand here and receive credit for her courage." He turned and looked at her directly in front of every person present with the particular steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him. No performance, no flourish, only the plain truth of what he meant. "Abigail," he said, "come up here, please." The crowd was very still. She walked forward. She was aware of her footsteps on the ground of Margaret somewhere behind her, making a soft sound of the faces, some familiar, some strange, some carrying the particular expression of people revising an opinion they'd held for a long time. She stopped beside Nathaniel, and he stepped back, and she was standing in front of all of them. She had prepared remarks. She looked at them for a moment, then set them aside. She said, "I kept records because records matter. Not because they are impressive, but because they are honest. A number does not lie. A column does not flatter or withhold depending on who's asking. I have spent my whole life preferring numbers to most other things for exactly that reason." A small laugh from the crowd. Genuine, not polite. The children who will come to this school did not need a ceremony. They needed a building. They needed desks and books and teachers and heat in January. They needed the money that was meant for them to actually reach them. She let that land. That is what the account work was about. That is all it was about. I am not interested in being celebrated for doing what any person with a ledger and a conscience should have done. She paused. But I will say this. I stood at the edge of this county's rooms for a long time, and I was told in various ways and various words that my usefulness was the most interesting thing about me. That I was good for figures and practicalities, and the quiet work that other people preferred not to do themselves. And I accepted that, because I did not know how to argue with it. She looked out at the faces. At the tenant families with their children. At the minister. At the judge. At Margaret, who was absolutely crying. At Nathaniel standing to her left with an expression she had finally learned to read. I know how to argue with it now. I am not my usefulness. I am not the sum of what I have managed and maintained and repaired in silence. I am a woman who chose every morning for 5 years to do the hard work when the easy thing would have been to stop. Her voice was steady. It did not waver. And if there is a girl in this county who is standing at the edge of a room right now, being told she is forgettable, I want her to hear this. The work you do when no one is watching is the most real work there is. Do not stop. The silence lasted exactly long enough. Then it broke, and the sound that replaced it was not polite applause. It was the particular sound of people who had been moved by something true, which is a different sound entirely fuller, less organized, and considerably harder to perform. Abigail stepped back. Nathaniel was beside her before she had finished the step. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply stood close enough that their arms touched, which was from him a language she had learned to read as fluently as the ledger columns she'd loved her whole life. Then he said low and clear for her ears only, "That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard." It was 4 minutes long, she said. "Abigail, I know," she said, and her voice finally was not entirely steady. "I know." The September afternoon stretched long and golden around the celebration that followed food conversation, children running between the adults' legs. The new academy building open for inspection, with its honest wooden floors, and its 4 good windows, and its rows of empty desks, waiting. She walked through the building with Nathaniel, and did not say much because the feeling was too large for words, and she had learned finally that some things did not need to be narrated. Mrs. Daly found her near the back of the building and pressed her hand once without a word. Thomas Greer's son was there with his family, and when he saw Abigail, he stopped and removed his hat and held it, and she nodded at him, and that was all that needed passing between them. The Hartley sisters approached her near the door, the two young women who had laughed with Caroline at the supper all those weeks ago. They were awkward about it, as people are when they owe something they don't know how to name. The taller one said, "Mrs. Whittaker, I want to say, that is, we wanted to say—" "It's all right," Abigail said. "We were unkind. At the Bellamy supper. I know," Abigail said. "And it is genuinely all right." She looked at them both, at their discomfort, at the honest embarrassment of two young women who had been thoughtless and were now at some small cost to their pride admitting it. "Don't do it to the next woman." They nodded. They walked away. Abigail watched them go and felt nothing like bitterness, which was, she thought, one of the quiet victories of the day. Not the speech, not the legal record, not the ceremony itself, but the simple fact that she had arrived at 36 years in this county, still capable of saying, "It's all right," and meaning it. Caroline was gone before the celebration ended. No farewell, no scene. Simply absent, the way things become absent when the room has moved on from them. Direct. They rode home in the evening, the September air carrying the first suggestion of autumn in its edges, and Margaret chattered the entire way. Bless her, she always chattered when she was happy, and their mother held Abigail's hand in the carriage and said nothing, which was the deepest thing she could have offered. At Whittaker Hall, the lanterns were already lit. Mrs. Daly had left supper on the table, and a note that said in her precise handwriting, "Well done, Mrs. Whittaker." 3 words, exactly sufficient. Margaret and their mother stayed for supper and left when the dishes were cleared, and then it was just the two of them, Abigail and Nathaniel, in the quieted house, with the autumn evening coming in at the windows. He poured 2 small glasses of bourbon, something he reserved for occasions he considered worth marking, and handed one to her. She took it. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She turned the glass in her hand. "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" "Tell me." "The teacup," she said. "At the Bellamy supper. I set it down because my hand was shaking and I didn't want anyone to see." She looked at him. "And you saw anyway." "I did," he said. "Why didn't you look away?" He considered the question the way he considered everything seriously, without performing the consideration. "Because you didn't run," he said. "Everyone in that room who could have helped you had already decided you weren't their concern. And you stood there shaking hand and all, and you stayed. I reckon that was the most courageous thing I saw that entire evening." He held her gaze. "I wasn't going to look away from that." Abigail felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for so long she had almost forgotten what stillness felt like. She thought about the girl she had been at that supper, standing at the wall, pressing her nails into her palm, telling herself that staying was not the same as surrendering. She thought about 5 years of accounts and creditors and tenant families and her father's debts and the quiet, relentless work of keeping everything from falling. She thought about the school fund and the letters and the Richmond supper and the kitchen table and the porch. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not used, not admired for utility, not valued for what you produced, but actually seen the way Nathaniel had been seeing her since a July ballroom when a candle stand fell and she caught it without looking back. She raised her glass slightly. "To plain speech," she said. He touched his glass to hers. To plain speech. She drank. Outside, the first crickets of the autumn evening were beginning. The fields of Whittaker Hall lay quiet in the dark, and somewhere on the property a door opened and closed, one of the tenant families settling in for the night, the ordinary sound of a life being lived on land that was cared for. Abigail set down her glass. She was no longer standing at the edge of any room. She was standing at the center of the life she had built with her own hands, in a house where every name was known and every debt was honest, and the man beside her had looked at her. Really looked at her, and had not once in all the months since looked away. She had spent years being the woman no one bothered to remember. She would spend the rest of her life being the woman none of them could forget.